My name is Debbie Gould, and I'm the president for the League of Women Voters of Tennessee. And as most of you know, we have an ongoing series of webinars about redistricting. The thing about redistricting is since it comes every 10 years we have to relearn what's going on and find out what's different and how we can make it better. And of course, the reason why the League of Women Voters is so concerned about it in Tennessee is, frankly, our history in Tennessee is that it's not been a very transparent process. And if there's anything that the League values, it's transparency in government and opportunities for public engagement about important issues like redistricting. So that's why we're really interested in today to hear from Yurij Rudensky, who is Redistricting Counsel at the Brennan Center for Democracy Program. And his primary area of focus is redistricting policy reform, race and redistricting jurisprudence, and bridging the scientific legal gap. He's also an adjunct professor at NYU School of Law, where he teaches the Brennan Center Public Policy Advocacy Clinic. He also has previous experience as an attorney at Columbia Legal Services in Seattle, where his practice focused on civil rights and economic justice that impact litigation and policy advocacy. And we are just delighted to have you here today, Yurij, to help us really understand more, particularly around communities of interest and that concept, and how we can be better self-advocates and help others be better advocates for themselves in this redistricting process as we go forward. So I will turn it over to you. Oh, and I should also say, if you have questions, the audience, we're going to be muted while the presentation's going on. Put your questions in the chat. And how would you like us to handle those, Yurij? Would you like us just to hold them on the side till after you're finished, or?
Yeah, that would be great. I'm really hoping to get through the presentation in a fairly expeditious manner and really leave plenty of time to dialogue and to talk through some of the issues that might be particular to Tennessee and what folks are thinking about and working on. And thank you very much, Debbie, for that introduction. And thank you all for having me here. It's really a pleasure. I would prefer for these sorts of things to be in person, but we will make do in this digital format. As was mentioned, I am a redistricting counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization. We work to reform and revitalize our systems of democracy and justice. Redistricting has long been a pillar of this work because in many ways, the redistricting process creates the building blocks of our democracy and ultimately dictates whether people truly have a voice in dictating who gets to decide the policies that apply to all of us. And so it's great to be here. It is a once-a-decade event, so it is good to go back to basics and to really think about things. And Tennessee, of course, in part, or at least litigation coming out of Tennessee and the League's work in Tennessee going back to the 50s and 60s is why we have redistricting, and there is a redistricting cycle to begin with. So it really is wonderful to be here. I would not have much of a career were it not for the work of the League of Women Voters Tennessee. And of course, what I'm talking about is the one person, one vote cases, which started with Baker v. Carr in the early 60s, that was the first really meaningful regulation of redistricting by the federal judiciary when the Supreme Court in the wake of Baker v. Carr established that political districts at all levels of government have to be roughly equal in population. And since they have to be roughly equal in population, as determined by the decennial census, that means they need to be periodically redrawn and rebalanced. And the question is, that's the really basic requirement of redistricting and why we go through this process. There are some other laws that apply, like the Federal Voting Rights Act and certain other considerations. But beyond that, it's really up to the states to dictate how the process unfolds. And that's really what we're here to discuss. And one of the things about communities of interest is it is a way to orient redistricting and to really center the needs of communities and people. And with that preface, I will share my screen and jump into some slides. Can everyone see the slide deck and not my email box? Great. Okay. There it is, the topic for today's discussion. So the way that I think about communities of interest is it is a guiding principle for redistricting, and I will get into what I mean by that. So first, let's start with a definition. A community of interest is a group of people that shares a common geography, so they live amongst each other or relatively close to each other, and common representational needs that are based on cultural, racial, ethnic, economic, social, or historic ties to each other. The key is, and this is the second bullet, is a community of interest should not be defined by political party preference or loyalty to a candidate or an elected official. And this does not mean that communities of interest don't have political preferences. And sometimes those political preferences are shared, but it shouldn't be factored in when communities of interest are being defined. And that's really the key, is what do you lead with? Do you lead with things that don't reduce people to labels of R and D, red team, blue team? Do you lead with what it is that people share besides those sorts of preferences? We will get a little bit deeper into what that means. So there are a number of states that are using communities of interest for guiding redistricting. The language that you see on the screen right now is from California, and California did not pioneer the community of interest oriented redistricting process, but it did really center it as the main driver of redistricting decisions. California, of course, uses an independent commission model of redistricting, and these citizen commissioners that are selected through a process that isn't overly political, and they are screened for their political ties. They take this very, very seriously. And so this is the language that California used, and this is what appears in the state's constitution. And as you can see, it's pretty thin. It doesn't give that much to hang a hat on. It just mentions that communities of interest are important. It mentions that city boundaries, county boundaries, neighborhood boundaries are important, and community of interests are important as well. We took that concept and we gave it a little bit more flesh. We gave some thought to, well, what are the sorts of things that people should think about? And one of the things that I've produced over my time at the Brennan Center is a guide to redistricting reform. Of course, we are past that window of opportunity to change the laws that control redistricting, but nonetheless, this guide can still be useful to think about some of these concepts. And we came up with language that communities of interest are areas with recognized similarities of interests, including but not limited to economic, social, cultural, geographic, or historic identities. And again, that second bullet shall not include common relationships with political parties, office holders, or political candidates. Now, this is model language, and it's important whenever creating policy language to adapt it to the specific needs of states. There are certain states where people really do identify with where they live. They have the name of the county that their car is registered on the license plate. Sometimes people really identify strongly with towns, like in New Hampshire. People always kind of lead with, this is the town that I'm from, or in other places, the county that someone's from is really important. And so there are instances where these sorts of political boundaries and subdivisions should be taken into account. But that really depends on how people view these divisions. And not, there's no hard and fast rule about whether these boundaries should be respected or not. And oftentimes, geographic features like rivers will serve as boundaries for a county, but the communities, especially if there is a bridge or other ways to get across that river, and communities will really view themselves as a single community, even though they may find themselves in different towns, different cities, or different counties because of their geographic proximity. So that's why we take a much more flexible approach with that. Now, this third example of community of interest language comes from S1 HR1, the For the People Act, the big democracy reform bill that is pending through Congress. And as you can see, and I'm sorry that I had to break it up because it was written on two, it went from one page to the next, the definition of communities of interest, but it is very, very close to what we suggest should be the controlling language in our model guide, and that is not accidental, but at the same time, it really is just to give guidance to the map drawers on the sorts of things that people should be testifying about and highlighting when giving input on what communities of interest are. One of the criticisms of communities of interest, though I think it's very misplaced, is people often say, well, this is pretty vague. First you list all of these different things: ethnic, racial, economic, tribal, social, cultural, geographic, historic. Which one of those? And the answer is all of them. It depends. It depends on the individuals, and it depends on the relevant regions. And the part of this criticism is saying, well, that doesn't necessarily produce fair maps. It doesn't prevent gerrymandering, and certainly lawmakers that are bent on producing certain political outcomes could find a way to describe the districts that they draw in these terms, and to say, well, I drew this incredibly gerrymandered district, but really there are deep social ties here, or there are common economic circumstances, and certainly there are enough things that are common among even the most different communities in this country that you could make that case. But all of these criticisms miss the purpose of communities of interest. It's not the purpose of having this as a requirement isn't to be able to run to court and to ask a judge to strike down a map and draw new districts because communities of interest weren't respected. It's to orient the redistricting process to be public facing. That is why communities of interest should be included in the criteria. It's to give the public a meaningful role in redistricting. And communities of interest requirements should be paired with prohibitions against racial discrimination and prohibitions against partisan gerrymandering. Those are the provisions that give redistricting laws teeth, that really provide a backstop against abuse, that give a court something to do should the process go off the rails. But it doesn't mean that communities of interest aren't useful, and having this requirement isn't useful. And to think about why and to understand why, it's important to take a step back and to think about why we redistrict in the first place. And I talked about the history of it and the role of the League and Tennessee in starting the redistricting cycle as a once a decade event. And the goal, as I mentioned, is to balance districts from a population standpoint. And the requirement is purely numerical, purely mathematical, that all districts at all levels of government need to have roughly the same number of people. That doesn't really inform how do you decide how to group people together to create these equally populated districts. And that's where communities of interest come in. Because the higher goal of redistricting and the higher goal of our entire system of governance, a representational democracy, is to have elected officials that reflect the population and the population's needs and concerns and views. And there's plenty of material to draw from if you're a history nerd like me, whether it's John Adams talking about, Congress and legislatures should be a portrait in the miniature of the population. So in other words, that it should be kind of a rough estimate of what the various communities look like and think is important. And the fact of the matter is, decade in and decade out, it's more than just the numbers that change. All sorts of things change. How people live, where people work, what industries are the dominant industries, what issues people are grappling with and dealing with. What schooling looks like, what is the demographic makeup? All of these sorts of things shift, and in an ideal world, that's what redistricting would be preoccupied with in capturing, is how do we draw lines? And there are trade-offs because of course, you can't satisfy everyone's wishes and desires, and you have to find a way to balance competing interests. But at the same time, These are the sorts of things that are the higher calling for redistricting that would give everyone fair representation. And without communities of interest, it's really easy to slip into gerrymandering. Because if you're not thinking about what are these principles, what are these things, what is the glue that holds communities together that suggests how to group people for purposes of political representation. If you're not thinking about these sorts of things, then you're thinking about, well, what kind of political outcomes should district maps produce? And even if the goal of that thinking isn't to, say, give one party an advantage over the other, or to shut out a racial community from representation because of animus toward that racial group, it's still going about things backwards. It's trying to produce what elections should do and not allow people to dictate that for themselves. And so that's really the reason why whenever I worked with advocates and lawmakers across the states or on federal reform, it's always important to orient redistricting around communities of interest, because advocates were like, well, you know, what does it matter? And I was like, well, do you want public hearings? Do you want the public to be able to testify? They were like, yes, of course, transparency is important. We need to have that sort of public buy-in. We need to have the public engage with redistricting. And my question was, well, what do you expect the public to testify about? What will the public inform the redistricting process about? Do you expect members of the public to be experts in political map making, have an encyclopedic knowledge of election outcomes, be able to determine how different district configurations will perform? And the answer is no, of course not. What people are experts in is where they live. They know their own communities. They know the needs of their communities. They know what makes sense in terms of how to draw a district that keeps people together, that can get together and organize, that can reach out to their legislator or congressperson, that can create the atmosphere where grassroots political campaigns are possible. And so that's really what this is all about. And so looking at that and considering that redistricting and communities of interest is all about capturing the way that the population has changed, just to set a baseline for this upcoming cycle in Tennessee, according to census data, and we do have census data when it comes to state population totals, Tennessee has added over 550,000 new people, or I guess the population grew, and a more accurate way to say it would be the population grew by more than 550,000 people to just under 7 million. And the map that you see is, it was put out by some data scientists at a university here in New York, actually. And they run a website called Redistricting and You, and they look, and what you're seeing there, the boundaries that you see is actually the state house map. And the shading is, the more purple a state house district is, the more overpopulated it is, meaning that in that district, the population grew faster than in other parts of the state where it may be held steady, maybe dipped. And so what you see here is there's been a lot of population growth in Middle Tennessee, in and around Nashville, and interestingly, less so in the city center, and more in some of the outlying areas. I'm by no means an expert in Tennessee geography, so I apologize if I am mischaracterizing what I'm seeing here, but there are certain trends, and so this gives a baseline of, well, where will representation need to change more significantly? The places that are shaded in yellow will need to bring people in. That's where the population has either decreased or grown less than in other parts of the state. And so up in the northwest corner, up in the northeast corner, that's where representation will change, where districts will need to get bigger. And in Middle Tennessee and outside of Memphis is where districts, the population is growing, and also in the Chattanooga, Knoxville, those areas as well. That's where really the population growth is happening. And so when you're thinking about communities of interest, the first thing is, where's the population changing? And then the question is again, all right, the population is changing. How do we configure that population into districts that preserve communities of interest? And there's a number of ways that you can identify them. First, starting with data is never a bad idea, again, because you can do that sort of baseline analysis of where are the changes happening. And it's important to look at demographic change as well. And the ACS, if you've ever poked around it, or if you have any technically minded people that are part of your advocacy groups, and often professors and students at universities are great resources for these sorts of things. A lot of folks use these for kind of engineering and technical jobs. So you got to get your set of technical minded folks that are good at navigating these data sets, that are good at using various tools to make it visually accessible, to be able to tell the story of what's happening in the population by the numbers. It's also good to pull other maps. And one of the things that's really important are things like watersheds, things like utility districts, school districts. There's a geography to so much of how we live our life and how government services and public services are provided. It's good to have things like commuting corridors, things of that nature. And really, if you look at a lot of the population growth in Tennessee, it follows major interstate corridors. And that's really pretty apparent when you start overlaying, even to an outsider like me, that really doesn't have much expertise in what's happening on the ground in Tennessee. There are things that become immediately apparent, and those are all important things, especially if you are in a leadership capacity, you're an organizer, even if you're a volunteer and you're trying to generate community of interest input. And that, of course, is the best source for the information. Again, no one knows communities better than community members themselves. And so crowdsourcing and public input is indispensable. And finding an effective way to encourage significant participation and significant public comment is oftentimes the biggest challenge, because people's lives are busy. And redistricting is one of those issues that's incredibly important, but it feels academic. It's not one of those kitchen table type issues. It's hard to get people care about it. And across the political spectrum, people really dislike gerrymandering. But when it comes to actually action, and I probably don't, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. It is hard to encourage people to come out. And so I'm going to transition now into talking about, well, if you can reach people, what are the things that you should be asking them to do with respect to identifying communities of interest? So first, there are a number of tools available this time around, and really this is for the first time ever, that are remarkable. I'll start with Representable, which is a wonderful tool, and it is created specifically for identifying communities of interest. They have prompts, questions that people can walk through that are the right questions to be asking. They have a mapping tool that allows people to just trace their own community, not to draw a district, not to draw a complete map, but just to identify, here is where my community is. And from this dashboard that Representable created, they can email it directly. And that is, they can email it directly to, say, lawmakers. They could email it directly to organizers and representatives and groups like the League of Women Voters and other civil rights and good government and civic organizations. Another and slightly more sophisticated tool is called Districtor. They skipped the last E in kind of the typical techie fashion, so it's District R is there. That's what the tool is called, and it's done by, it was created by these excellent data scientists from Tufts that are doing phenomenal work around redistricting. And it's a slightly more sophisticated tool, but similar to Representable, they allow people to draw their own communities, and they walk through all of the various things that should be present when describing a community of interest. One of the cool things about Districtor is it doesn't just allow you to trace your own community, but it allows you to also place relevant institutions within that place. So you can locate your church, you can locate the school where your kids go to, you can put the shopping center where you get your groceries, you can put where you work, all of those sorts of things, and you can label those things, and it creates a more compelling visual when it's submitted, because this isn't arbitrary. This is where you live your life, and that's why you're advocating for that community to be kept whole. The last tool, and this one does have community of interest functionality, but it really is more designed for drawing complete districts, is called Dave's Redistricting app. Also a free tool. It's got very powerful ways of analyzing district configurations. It's pretty user-friendly, and in many ways it's similar to the other ones. I do think for a broad general population audience, the first two tools are a little bit more user-friendly, but the folks at Dave's Redistricting do excellent work. And it is worth checking out, especially if there are people among your circles that are more sophisticated or just more interested in redistricting and want to kind of do a more complete district drawing exercise. So once, the tools are incredibly important, but in order to be able to use the tools, here are the things that people need to think about. Who's part of your community? So if you're out there and you're asking people to create a community of interest submission, whether through one of those digital tools that are now available, or just on paper, or through oral testimony, these are the questions that people should be answering. Who's part of the community? Where do they live? And what's the glue that holds them together? What's the organizing principle? Why are the boundaries being set the way that they are? What are some of the important places? Is this something that's oriented around industry and work? Is this about environmental concerns? Or is this just, this is where I go about my life day in and day out? This is where this is my church, my kid's school, that sort of thing. But then the important thing is to transition those types of descriptions about kind of like the who, the where, the why, and to talk about, well, why does this community need political representation? Because that's the next step. I mean, being a cohesive community is great, but we're talking about keeping a community together so it can be represented. And so you have to answer that question. What are the issues there? And what are the resource needs? So in other words, and a good exercise, especially when you're dealing with people who are not as involved in redistricting as you are, is asking the question, you know, if there was a community meeting held, if there was a town hall, what are the issues that would be raised if you drew the community this way? What would people talk about? What resources do they need? Is it needing more park space so kids can go and play? Is it needing to resolve a pollution issue due to a nearby coal fire plant, power plant or something of that sort? Is it that traffic has gotten bad and people can't complete their commutes and it's a real burden on them getting in and out of an urban center back to their suburban home community? What are the pressing issues? And that's really the key. And the flip side of that is also thinking about the current map or a proposed map and whether those boundaries would make it difficult for that community to organize. In other words, would that town hall happen if a boundary was drawn to split that community apart? And first of all, is that community currently split? And then second of all, if it were split in the future, would it make it hard to organize? And the thing about it, of course, is oftentimes there are multiple boundaries. You know, there are boundaries for state house districts, there are boundaries for state senate districts, there are boundaries for congressional districts, and so all of those things are important, because if you're trying to get an issue addressed at the state level, you don't just have to convince the state house to take it up, you have to convince the state senate to as well. And so if the state house preserves the community of interest, but the state senate splits it, that's a relevant thing to think about too. So think about all of these overlapping political districts that kind of layer on top of each other. On the congressional level, it's obviously a little different, and the national approach and scope is a different one. But these are the sorts of questions to be asking. And then finally, just to kind of wrap it up, though I know that this is all a bit I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record here, is a checklist for really putting it into practice. And I drew this checklist from some of the materials that the tools themselves create. So if you go to Districtor, if you go to Representable, they have guides that walk people through. And it will be familiar if you look at those guides, because I drew on them for this presentation. But one thing is pick a name. Always a good idea to brand things. Find a way to describe it, especially if there's kind of a broadly accepted name that people already know about. Throw some descriptive aspects into it, that, you know, this is a community of auto workers in, you know, that work at Nissan and Volkswagen. Identify the building blocks that you're going to use. And this is more of a technical thing, but there's, you know, the census data can be packaged and produced in different levels of geography. Some people might want to use precincts, electoral precincts, which is a different level of geography. Some people might want to use counties or town boundaries, especially if you're talking about congressional districts. You might be talking about bigger geographical units than what's used in redistricting. So it's important to just set that out in advance. And then describe the interests that unite the individuals living in the area, fill in the important place names, highlight the key features, describe the important places, and really tell the story. And I really can't emphasize that enough, that is really key. And so with that, I'm going to pause. I know that there were, and I will stop sharing my screen. I was going to get into transparency, but we can talk about that more as a group. I want to make sure to leave ample time for questions and to make things a little bit more interactive. So the first question from Carrie is whether the federal legislation and the two principal bills that are currently pending are For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, whether they will nullify state legislature attempts to gerrymander and restrict the vote. And they would absolutely create critical safeguards. The thing about where we're at, unfortunately, is the For the People Act, the redistricting portions have a lot about how the process should play out in states for redistricting. There isn't time for those procedural rules to take effect. Redistricting is already happening. And so what those bills, if they pass and become law, would do is create safeguards. They would create new tools. They would allow people to go to court if districts are drawn unfairly, if voting restrictions are unfair, and to ensure that there isn't racial discrimination and that there isn't undue partisan favoritism in maps. And so these are very needed. The legal landscape has changed over the course of the last 10 years in a way that will make it very difficult to challenge bad maps. And so it's really important to make sure if things hold, if these bills don't get done, it's more important than ever to make sure that maps are good when they're first drawn. And so it's great to be here, and it's going to take a lot of people power. It's going to take a lot of media attention and just holding politicians accountable, I guess. The second question is drawing communities of interest across a very large and diverse state. And that is an excellent question. And this is one of the factoids that I know about Tennessee, that if you're in the western end of Tennessee, you are closer to Dallas, Texas than the other side of the state. And if you're in the eastern end, you're closer to the Atlantic Ocean than Memphis. That does pose challenges. And the key is picking your spots and having people who understand the various regions and breaking it down. The good thing about communities of interest is it's not like drawing a proposed map. You don't have to do the whole state. If you have good folks in Knoxville, and if you have good folks in Memphis, and if there are other allies and organizations in Nashville and in Smyrna or where have you, that's fine. You can submit community of interest where you can get the input from, and it should still inform the redistricting process. One of the goals, though, is to get quality over quantity. If one of our researchers at the Brennan Center studied public comment in redistricting, he wrote a PhD dissertation about it. And one of the things that he found was when people come in and just say the same thing, and person after person just says the same thing over and over again, it's a lot less effective than when people personalize it. And so that's really the key, is people need to be talking not off a script, but from personal knowledge and personal need. Visual aids are really helpful. And that holds true both for in-person testimony and for emails and that sort of thing. Is there a way to find out what communities of interest were used in the last redistricting process? I am going to venture a guess that no community of interest considerations factored into Tennessee's last redistricting process. But the bigger question about, well, if community of interest considerations didn't, what did? And this is one of the fundamental problems with this area, is that it is a black box process. It is closed door. The rooms are probably no longer smoke filled, but same principle. These are people that are working confidentially, and they are political operatives. And what they're doing, it's really not that complex. Some of the tools that they use are complex, but the idea behind it is very simple. What they're doing is they are labeling every single household and every single voter and person in the state as a Democrat or Republican, strong Democrat, strong Republican, somewhere in the middle. They're labeling those same people and figuring out how likely are they to vote and what kind of elections do they vote in. And then they're using that information to draw maps, and they're running different election scenarios through them. A good year for Democrats, a bad year for Democrats, a good year for Republicans, a bad year for Republicans, a good year for both, a bad year for both. A year where Donald Trump is on the ballot, a year where Donald Trump is not on the ballot. All of these sorts of things, and they're trying to calibrate a map that produces consistent results across all of those different circumstances. And that's really the evil of gerrymandering, is it locks in political outcomes regardless of what people are doing or thinking. And even no matter what anyone's political preferences are, I know everyone is at some point frustrated with their own preferred parties and candidates and elected officials. and not being able to swap them out is just a huge problem and drives cynicism and causes people to withdraw. So it is an unfortunate state of affairs. And transparency is a huge issue, and it truly boggles my mind that something that is as publicly important as redistricting can occur behind closed doors, that it's not a public process as a matter of course, and that the public cannot inspect the data and the decisions that are being made. But unfortunately, that is what it is. In terms of the challenges to court systems, we are seeing this, perhaps not across the country, but definitely this is one of the things that's happening in places where systems are becoming more political. It is a whole kind of a onslaught that leaves no stone unturned, including thinking about not just where can redistricting cases be heard, but how can they be brought, making it harder for people to raise claims, to get their day in court, to get a judge to take a look at things. And we are seeing this. For example, in Ohio, reforms passed that take steps in the right direction, but one of the things that had to be given up, and one of the things that's written into the law, is that a court, the state Supreme Court, can hear challenges to Ohio's map. But if it finds a violation, the court has no ability and no right to fix the violation. It has to send it back to the legislature. And so that's, for having seen that play out many times, including in North Carolina, that's really not best practice. You don't give folks you don't want to give folks that abuse their positions and their authority a second bite at the apple to try to get something maybe more modest through, but still not in the public interest. But these sorts of things, unfortunately, are happening. We're seeing it in Missouri. We're seeing in Ohio, as I mentioned, and so Tennessee is not alone in this, but it really is unfortunate. I think the thing that I would draw on as consolation is, I think fundamentally all of these things are signs of weakness, not strength. And it's not to say that this sort of weakness isn't dangerous, but it does signal that who is scared of the people, who is scared of the voters, and it means that there is a desire to not be accountable and to create insulation from that. So that's and the judicial process is certainly a part of that. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to stick around.
I don't see any more right now, but this has been very helpful. We're really realizing with an August 16th deadline for the census data that we really hope to really motivate people to take this seriously, and as you say, to get those stories out there, because it's the stories that might actually change some district lines. So this has been very helpful. Are there any other questions before you go? Well, thank you again. And Are there additional resources that we should be looking at on your website that might be helpful?
We certainly have plenty of resources. The various guides like that I was saying in terms of creating independent commissions and criteria we annotated them. And so a lot of the values that need to be in redistricting and reflected in redistricting are articulated there. So please, by all means, take a look at that. And just as a brief closing note, I will say that when I look at what will happen over the coming months, I do think we are in for a very, very challenging redistricting year. But it's important to not be deterred, and it is important to tell the stories and to record what's happening, because I am confident that the tide will shift and circumstances will change. And in order to be able to make a strong case for reform, which I am confident we will be able to win at some point in the future, we have to understand the abuses of the past. And so bearing witness, recording what's happening, and having that record is incredibly valuable. And I can tell you, as someone that works on this, it is so helpful for me when I can look back and find a report that cataloged how things played out and what happened, because we do look to, well, what happened in 2001? What happened in 2011? How can we make sure to safeguard against the trickery and the abuses that played out? And the same thing is going to be true for 2021. And so thank you all for being here and everything that you do. And don't hesitate to reach out to me and to the Brennan Center more broadly if we can be useful in the future.
Thank you again. It's been very helpful.
Thank you, Yurij. We really appreciate it.